opening quotation. Okay. Time starts now. One of the most important things to do as a scientist is to be able to stand on top of the mountaintop and yell, "I was wrong!" But we humans are so hesitant to do that. We love being right the first time. And that brings us to today's quotation. From Hannah Gadsby, an autistic Australian comedian, "We think it's more important to be right than it is to appeal to the humanity of people we disagree with." Now, what this quotation is saying is that when we disagree with someone, it's so easy to breed some animosity and just argue for the sake of arguing instead of seeing the person in front of us. And thus we think it's more important to be right than to see that person in front of us. And today we're going to argue the complete validity of this quotation, but more from the perspective of we love to be right because that allows us to stay within our in-group and a hive mind, if you will. And we'll look at this from two levels of analysis. First of all, the way that humans naturally conform, how that's part of our human nature, that we love to be in our groups like that. And also, why it is so important to admit when we're wrong, when we're not agreeing with the group. Now, to start us off, humans are very conforming social creatures. It's just who we are. And we can see a number of psychological studies that affirm this. One such example is Solomon Ash's famous experiment in which participants will sit in with a group of actors and they'll look at 3 lines. One line is very visibly longer than the other. We'll call this line A. But now all these actors will be insisting that line B is really the longest of the 3. And what happens? Participants will start to conform to the group and will at least verbally agree, yes, line B is longer than line A, even though it is clearly line A that's longer. In this case, it is more important to agree with the group and be fitting in than to actually be right. Furthermore, we see humans conform so naturally in the famous Stanley Milgram experiment, in which participants will deliver increasingly high voltage shocks to a test taker when they get the answer wrong. And as they come up to these lethal voltages, the researcher will tell the participant to keep going for the sake of the experiment. And 2 out of 3 times, the participant would deliver that lethal shock. And there's something to be said about that, how we humans will naturally tend to value obedience and conformity over virtue and being right. So overall, this is a very natural thing that people do, thinking it's important to be right because it keeps us conforming with the group. Now, with that being said, let's talk about why exactly it's so important to admit when we're wrong. One thing that happens is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is a very prime example of why it's so important to admit when we're wrong, because it is a very natural resistance to admitting when we're wrong. When we research and find evidence for our claim, we're going to laser focus on the evidence that already affirms what we believe, and we shut out any of the other evidence. And that is why it's so important to be mindful about this natural tendency to just be right for the sake of the group. Confirmation bias is one of these things that keeps us in alignment with the group because that helps us survive better. Now, an example of when it is destructive to not admit when you're wrong is the protagonist of the novel The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. His name is Amir. Now, Amir watches his best friend, Hassan, be jumped just right in the streets, and he does nothing. And this causes a rift between Amir and Hassan, but Amir refuses to admit he is wrong, and this causes a lifetime of regret for him. Wouldn't the same thing happen to us? If we don't admit when we're wrong, that we start to feel lifetime of regret? That's what happens when it's so important for us to just be right. So in conclusion, we've covered how humans naturally conform to what's right in groups and why it's so important to admit when we're wrong. Because we do think that it's more important to be right than it is to appeal to the person who's right in front of you. Thank you.